Welcome to On the Sidelines, the show that usually discusses sports and how sports intersects our lives. However, this series of shows will mostly depart from sports and will center upon an event that is still being discussed long after most sporting events have faded from our memories. Throughout U.S. history, there are dates that are burned into our memories, such as December 7th, 1941, and September 11th, 2001. This year, we commemorate the 60th anniversary of another such date, November 22nd, 1963, the day that the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. Inspired by the book, Where Were You?, that was compiled and edited by Gus Russo and Harry Moses for the 50th anniversary, I wondered what ordinary U.S. citizens were doing on that ever-so-ordinary Friday before Thanksgiving in 1963 that turned out to be anything but ordinary. For some people, the news of the assassination was received in this manner.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
But for many Americans, the news would be heard much differently. On the Sidelines is so grateful to the current residents of Westborough who remember November 22nd, 1963, and who graciously shared their stories with us. Let us listen to their memories of this event. We're with Ted Jasiewicz, longtime business owner in Westborough, or in Worcester, really. But we're going to go back, before he was in business maybe, to November 22nd, 1963, and maybe just November or that era with John F. Kennedy. Ted, welcome to On the Sidelines and your thoughts going back to November of 1963.
Nice to be here, Paul.
Good to be here with you.
It was a very tragic time in our lives, quite frankly. And it affected any of us who, in fact, were involved and felt as though we were watching and knowing what was going, trying to understand what was going on in this crazy world in which we live. I was working at the time in Pennsylvania. I was working for a corporation called Philco.
Philco made the TVs?
Well, they were makers of TV, but right. At that time, they were one of the forerunners in the manufacture of some of the electronic capability, for example, transistors, which then led to microcircuits et al., that kind of a thing. So at that time, I was still with them, but they were shutting down the operation. But what I do remember about that terrible day, actually, I was at work. It was Friday afternoon.
Now, this was in Pennsylvania. So did you grow up in Pennsylvania, or?
Born and reared in Pennsylvania. Yeah. In fact, what we call the hard coal region.
Yeah.
Which was up around Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Frackville is my hometown, where I was born and reared. And family background, my dad was a coal miner, anthracite, and that's what finally got to him.
Right, yeah.
But I was a coal digger is what I was.
So you graduated from school down there and then had a job with Philco.
With Philco, I went to Penn State University. Yeah. Of course, I also spent time in the Army. In the Korean War, I joined the military, the Army, and at the time of the draft, they were still drafting, and I decided I'll go ahead and join up. So I was what we call regular Army.
Yeah.
And but I ended up in a training company as a field force sergeant, and I was a training sergeant. And I was they stationed me out in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Okay, but that all was right after leaving Philco.
Yeah.
I mean, before working at Philco, because after the Army, then I went to Penn State in '54.
Yeah.
Left there in '58, and then went to Philco. And again, worked there 5 years approximately, maybe 6 years the dates do get mixed.
Go back and forth, yeah.
They go back and forth. And Philco, Sprague Electric was a licensee of ours.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Sprague,
right here in Worcester, yeah.
And I was the traveling engineer who would visit the facilities, other facilities that were making the same product that Philco was making. Philco was unique in that they had a lot of automated equipment, far more sophisticated than one could imagine. If you look back in the world of electronics, they were quite a facility. So I was a troubleshooter, and I was, at that time, I was chief engineer of manufacturing at Philco, that particular manufacturing operation.
So you were at the Philco plant.
Philco plant,
then.
Spring City, Pennsylvania.
Right.
Small. It was a large plant, but a small town. Yeah.
And so how did we hear about what happened?
Sorry?
How did we hear about what happened that day?
Actually, it was in the afternoon. I was still there because that was what we did, and just in the factory, obviously down in the machine shop, someone had access to a communication, television or something, probably had a camera. And the word immediately came about when it occurred. And I remember then, of course, going down the steps into the shop, and of course, people were gathered around. This time, the women had already changed shift. We had hundreds of women working there. So there was a shift change. That had already occurred. And so I'd gone downstairs and gathered around with the guys and, and saw this thing occur, and that kind of an atmosphere. And what I do recall was one comment made by one of the people there, which was, in fact, "So what, huh? It's good for the world, okay? He's gone," which was very depressing. And at the time, of course, you had, I would have to tell you that my background basically was, I'm not a liberal, but I'm in fact, I'm a middle roader. And I felt that at that time that John F. Kennedy was of value to us, all the younger generation, because he would bring a younger life to politics. And so there were some vindictive comments made about his, thank God he died and killed, this sort of thing. That was not uncommon, was being said at that time. And then, of course, after that, it was phone calls, phone calls to home, to mom and family, and asking, did they see, were they aware of this incredible tragedy which occurred in Texas? And I would have to tell you, we were glued then to the television after that, just trying to stay in step with what was being talked about. And unfortunately, there never had been, and there still isn't, any real explanation as to the whys and wherefores of the assassination, at least what I have been able to determine.
Mm-hmm. So the plant, they just closed the plant and said, you go home now.
I'm sorry, Paul?
They closed the plant. Philco said, go home.
Yes.
In the afternoon.
Eventually,
yeah.
Yeah.
Did you see in Pennsylvania, because most of us grew up here in Massachusetts, did you see Pennsylvania as Republican, Democrat? Were there any pluses and minuses?
No, I actually saw it as in the middle. I always saw it either or. Never saw it, on either side. But I think if you look at my background, my upbringing in a family, a fairly large family with a father who we existed because he worked in the coal mines and this sort of thing. So one would say we would lean to, at that time, to the workers' side of the world, whatever that meant.
Yeah.
You know, but we never had, my hometown was basically, I would say, Republican. Frackville was more in line with the Republican mentality, but never to an extreme.
Right.
We never called each other Republicans and or Democrats. You know, that sort of vindictiveness did not exist, as I recall, in growing up. But we spent an awful lot of time over the next weeks listening and trying to gather and learn more about what might have happened. And till this day, of course, we do not know. And I think it's fair to say when I say we, the world does not know.
Exactly, yeah, exactly what happened. And I think it was the first time that really we were glued to the television. I mean, that's where we received most of the information.
Yes.
Television. It was still somewhat in its infancy. We didn't have 24-hour everything that we have now in social media. But I think, from my standpoint, TV was our media.
That was it. Absolutely. Yeah. We were fortunate to have a television set.
That's right. Many people still didn't, probably.
Yeah, actually,
in 1963.
We were able to have one, and quite frankly, that is what we did. Of course, my mother had favorites, and some of I can't remember the names anymore. Some television shows that she would watch. A few of the old timers, the singers, and that sort of thing. Those shows, and in between that was the news.
Right.
But I don't remember the television being populated largely by news. I think, the way I look at it today, there are very few times you can run up and down channels and not bump into news somewhere. Whereas back then it was you're more apt to run into silly shows and so-called entertainment.
Yeah, I can remember John Cameron Swayze, the news was like 15 minutes, and then they went to a half hour. So it was still in its infancy.
It was, absolutely.
And as you say now, it's 24-hour wherever. Maybe it's the truth, maybe it isn't the truth, but it's 24-hour.
Yeah. What I do remember is that we did get ensconced really taken up into following the events of the assassination. And probably the forecast, or rather broadcast, I remember most was by Cameron Swayze, who basically made a comment relative to, I did bring it back the other night, okay, because I was interested in knowing, again, did I remember exactly what he said or what his conclusions were. And his remarks were, he was talking about the fact that Oswald was never tried in any shape or form. Therefore, there was not any public record of what he had to say directly about the assassination. Nothing in any shape or form. He was never tried, basically never arrested. I mean, he was.
But there was never any trial.
Never a trial in any shape. Therefore, there wasn't any information at all regarding maybe what his background was. But I often wondered, Swayze, what basically, as I remember his comments, he commented that because of that, the public did not have access to any background information to him, nor to Ruby. Ruby, of course, who then assassinated, you would say, Oswald.
Yeah, that's Sunday, huh?
The other thing I thought was interesting in all of these things, and by looking at some of the history, I remember I didn't understand, for example, why Oswald had access to that. He worked in that building, by the way, I believe 6 months, something like, or 9 months. And it was not uncommon for him to have a rifle with him. Okay? And he had the rifle in the building. And course, we do not know when he took it in there, when he started taking it in there, and maybe it was just perhaps, if you think back, perhaps related to the reality. I want people to think it's a common thing. I'm just a guy who carries a rifle, you see.
Another day in the life, yeah.
Yeah, and but I always, of course, eventually you look at the experts, Paul, as you know. But in this regard, it's fair to say there are not any experts. I fired a weapon in the military. I was supposedly an expert at shooting the M1 rifle, okay, one of the training courses we had. I cannot imagine him, up there in that building and a moving target, and how he managed to get off 3 shots, supposedly hit in the neck, in the shoulder, and in the head. I mean, he'd have to be an extreme schooled shooter with a weapon which was particularly wonderful because, when you must adjust when you have a weapon like that. You have to adjust your sight for distances. So obviously he knew what the distance was, my opinion again, so that if he were going to fire, it was not going to be necessarily high or low. All these things are part of, I'm sure everyone talked about them, but because there was not a deep look into the assassination in that regard, the experts never really, I don't think, ever got involved to that point because obviously they did not consider it of value, but we did.
Well, Ted, I think you're on target with your remembrances and appreciate you coming down. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Nice to be here.
So I'm with Bonnie Perron, and longtime Westborough resident, and on November 18th, 2023, you will be 102 years old. Happy birthday. Now we're going to go back 60 years when you're a little bit younger. On November 22nd, 1963, what do you remember of John F. Kennedy, the assassination, and the events of that time?
Well, I can remember them quite well.
Yeah?
But it wasn't anything. I was just a housewife doing my housewife things. I might have been ironing, I don't know, something.
Well, you thought it was an ordinary day.
That's what I mean, an ordinary day. I had 2 daughters that they were in high school. And they went to high school, not at Westborough High.
Yeah.
They went to a parochial school in Milford.
Okay.
And I was just waiting for them to come home. And they were late coming home. The bus would drop them off downtown and they'd walk home. And they were a little late coming home, but, I just figured they were kids, whatever they were doing. And when they came in, the 2 girls and a friend, and they were crying. They were crying. And that's how I found out about JFK's death. From them coming in, because they had stopped at St. Luke's Church to say a prayer. That's why they were late getting home, on their way home to me. And they came in the door crying about it. That's all I remember about it.
Well, that's enough to remember. So somewhere along the line, your daughters found out, but they found out.
Yeah, they found out before I found out.
You don't know how they found out, but they found out.
Yeah. And they had, when they got off the bus, instead of coming right home, they stopped at church.
St. Luke's.
And said a prayer and came home. And they were, all 3 of them were crying as they came in the door.
Well, you must have been wondering what was going on
because
when young girls come in.
Yeah, and the fact that they were late getting home. I don't know what to expect.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's all I remember about it.
Well,
so we all just sat down and just listened to the news and like everybody else did.
Yeah, well, I think it was an ordinary day that became anything but ordinary.
Yeah.
And everybody was, at that time, started to gravitate toward the televisions that we had at the
I
point in
know.
time.
They were all glued to the television.
And
I remember that famous news commentator that said John Kennedy died at 10 something, and he was broken up when he was saying it.
yeah, that was Walter Cronkite. Yeah.
Oh, well, I couldn't remember who was
Yeah.
Walter Cronkite.
And everyone believed Walter.
Yeah,
And it was
he was really upset.
He was.
Yeah.
Well, I think
I remember that too, but
well, I
yeah.
think the world was
yeah,
upset.
yeah.
But we want to thank you
Oh,
for being and
no
talking to
charge,
us.
no charge.
Okay. Thank you very much, buddy.
Okay, thanks
Okay,
a lot. Nice
go-
meeting.
We're with John Gallinagh, board member of Westborough TV. John, we are glad to have you here and to hear about your recollections and thoughts of November 22nd, 1963.
Well, first, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. For me, it was really a tragic day. I had just gotten out of the Navy, believe it or not, coming back from Cuba, which was part of the conspiracy that was going on.
Okay.
And I went back to work at a bank. And
Here in Massachusetts?
no, in New York.
You were in New York at that
I
point.
worked for what is now Bank of New York. So I'm back to work. And we didn't have cell phones or anything like that, but my father left a message saying, you know, you should come home. And I said, well, I can't come home. I said, I've got to work, you know.
Now, what were you doing at the bank? What
I was
your
just a
job?
teller.
You were a teller
Yeah, just-
in the bank in New York City.
Yeah. And I was waiting to get into the management program, but that's another story. That's what I was doing, and I was shocked. I tried to get down to the St. Patrick's and was unable to. I was able to make it to Bobby Kennedy's funeral at St. Patrick's, but a few days after that happened, I'm at work. My father leaves a message with the manager saying, you have to come home. And again, my answer was, Dad, I can't come home. I'm working. Okay, it'll have to wait. So went home, and there was a letter from the Department of the Navy, registered letter. Opened it up, and it says, be prepared, you're being reactivated. We call back to duty. And they gave me my duty station. It was with a construction battalion, a CB battalion. And but they never cut my travel order, so I did not have to go back. But it was, for me, the loss of John F. Kennedy was almost personal. He was that kind of a charismatic person that you felt a connection with him. And, I served during my ship was the USS Essex, a aircraft carrier that was specialized in anti-submarine warfare. And we actually had pulled into Guantanamo Bay, and we were supposed to go ashore onto the base, and the ship just silently slid out of the harbor. We did not know what was going on. And so I was up on the flight deck, and the firing off rounds towards the Cuban coast. I thought, that's very strange. And again, no communication.
Yeah.
And it was only when I actually came home, I was on deployment for that one for about 5 months, and our primary mission was to chase Russian submarines that were trying to trying to get into Cuba. And there were 3 in particular that were carrying nuclear weapons that they wanted to make Cuba a nuclear state. And our ships were able to find them and stop them, and that when I got home, then it was we knew all about it, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So then I was home for a couple of weeks, and then we were sent back down to Cuba, and again, we were patrolling, but this time our mission was to prevent, we were enforcing what John F. Kennedy said was the quarantine. He used that word because he did not want to use the word blockade, because blockade would be an act of war. And so he was, used that particular word, that it was the quarantine, but in my opinion, it was the blockade, because we were stopping all sorts of ships going into Cuba. So anyway, that's kind of related to, Kennedy in a way. The ship I was on was also involved in the Bay of Pigs, and if you remember that, the military people wanted to invade Cuba, and
John Kennedy does, yes.
And then Bobby Kennedy is the one that I think supposedly said no, we should not do that, and they called that off. So that was kind of an embarrassment from a foreign policy standpoint, but probably the right thing to do. We certainly didn't want to have a nuclear war, for sure, with what was then the Soviet Union. So there was a lot of things going on at that time, and of course a lot of rumors after his assassination,
Well, John, we want to thank you for your memories of November '63, plus your connection to John Kennedy prior to that, serving in the United States Navy. Thank you very much, John.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Glad to be here.
We welcome Gibbs Mitchell, former professor at Worcester State University, to On the Sidelines. Gibbs, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're going to go back a few years, 1963.
Yeah.
Whatever you were doing in that November '63, that time period. What can you tell us?
And by the way, it was Worcester State College when I was teaching there, and they changed over, but okay.
It was Worcester State Teachers even before that.
And Teachers College before that.
That is correct.
And then it was a 2-year normal school before that, which goes way, way back.
Oh, we got history on the brain here.
I was teaching.
Yeah.
I was teaching at a place called in Swampscott, Massachusetts, in the Swampscott High School, and I was teaching social studies, what they called social studies.
Yeah.
And I was in class. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this class where I'm trying to get some point across, the PA system comes on. And there's a fellow kind of like you doing the news.
Yeah.
And I couldn't figure out what it was. At first I said, have they piped into one of my colleagues' classes and they're broadcasting his class? What are they doing that for? And then I listened to a little while, and I think I finally figured it out that what they were reporting was Kennedy had been shot.
And you had students in the class.
I had students in the class.
Yeah.
And I talked to my wife about this before I came down. And she said she was teaching in a place called Andover Junior High School, which is where we had met, by the way, okay? And she said a student burst in and said, the president's been shot, okay? And he was still alive at that point, apparently, So that's how she came to find out. And then after it occurred, I remember driving home and seeing her and saying, "Do you know?" Yes, she knew all about it. And I remember I had a conversation with a student who was one of the class high mucks, and they had planned a dance for that night. And kids, their social life probably is more important than
top priority.
Even the death of a president, she said. And I said, Judy, the dance is canceled. And she said, well, couldn't we, contact the parents and see? I said, your president has been shot. And I think he was dead at that point.
Yeah.
And so then she finally relented, and on it went. And then I remember my wife and I sat, it was black and white television then.
Those days, huh?
And we watched the whole damn thing on TV as it played out. And I remember sending out, as many other people did, a condolence card to Jackie. Mm-hmm. And it was pretty emotional. I mean, it was It was something that doesn't happen very often in American life, you know.
Yeah. Now, did you dismiss class, or what? Do you remember what you did with your
That
students?
I don't recall.
I
think it was a Friday, wasn't it?
It was a Friday
Yeah.
afternoon. It was a beautiful Friday afternoon. Yeah.
And I think they went ahead and had class on Monday, but it was the weekend.
Yeah. It was
And
Thanksgiving was coming up.
I think they did dismiss the classes,
Yeah.
and, you know, and away you went, you know.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about, you know, you said in your view of Kennedy, I remember that there was talk at the time, because he was 2.5 years into his term there.
Presidency, right.
There was talk about his poll ratings, you know, or whatever. Was he going to make it a second term, you know, that sort of thing. And I look back now because I taught a lot of this. LBJ was looked upon as kind of, you know, here you had this really bright, articulate man who had gotten elected to the presidency. Everybody loved him. They still love the Kennedys. And here was Johnson, who was not the greatest orator in the world, and kind of clumsy and that sort of thing. But the thing is that Johnson was able to accomplish things that Kennedy had tried to do in terms of civil rights,
Right.
that they had a huge landslide victory where they got huge majorities in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and he got through this kind of thing. I used to teach a course in immigration history, and we had immigration laws dating from about the 1920s up through that period of time that were very restricted of people from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe. You would, if you lived in Italy or Poland, you might put in a request for immigration, and 15 years later you might.
Oh, even the Chinese.
Yeah. Well, that was a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Ted Kennedy managed to push that kind of thing through during the Johnson administration. We'd never gotten that kind of legislation. And now we're backsliding, you know, who knows what's going to happen, you know. But, you know, that kind of thing. And then, of course, the civil rights stuff. Kennedy, I'm not sure he could have managed it. Johnson knew the Senate. He knew how to push through. You had bipartisanship. Everett Dirksen, a Republican, one of the leading Republicans. Without Dirksen, we would have never gotten a lot of this civil rights legislation. You had Strom Thurmond and James O. Eastland and people like that in the South who were Democrats, so-called, who wouldn't support it. And Johnson used Republican votes to get that through as a bipartisan legislation that got through the voting rights legislation. Yeah. So his legacy kind of went a little beyond his life, you know. Yeah.
Well, we want to thank you for coming and giving
Yeah.
us your thoughts on that day in history.
My pleasure.
That many
My
of
pleasure.
us remember.
And I hope you have a great program on this. It's a good topic.
Well, we'll let you watch it.
You bet.
Okay,
You
thank
bet.
you.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
We're with Tom Burke, longtime resident of Westborough and a chemical engineer. But let's go back to November 22nd, 1963, and that weekend. Tom, your remembrances of that time.
Well, first of all, I had graduated from Lowell Tech that year as a chemical engineer, and I was working for, it was U.S. Rubber at the time in Naugatuck, Connecticut. And I think it was somewhere close to noontime when it came over the radio and it went through the office like wildfire that President Kennedy had been shot. And to me, he was like an icon, a young guy, served in the military, you know, somebody that people liked and was doing a lot of good things. So it was a very sad thing when I heard that. And I got up, went out of the office, and I worked in a I was in the training program at the time for U.S. Rubber, and I was working in the synthetic rubber plant. So I went out onto the superstructure where all the reactors were and looking down the Naugatuck Valley, kind of meditating on what had just happened and what the impact of that was. It was a very sad day for us and for many people. And just a couple of memories. Back when I was at Lowell Tech, my roommates and I lived in an old apartment up on Textile Avenue in Lowell. And this is when President Kennedy had ordered the blockade of the ships coming in from Russia to bring missiles into Cuba. And I remember, this is kind of something I always think about. One of my roommates is coming up the stairs. He had 8 cans of Dinty Moore's beef stew. I said, Bob, what is this for? He said, well, he says, we're probably going to be nuked by Khrushchev, and I want to have enough food to keep me going for a while. I says, Bob, if they drop a bomb in Boston, this building is going to fall down. It's not going to survive. But anyway, that was one of the memories of back then. And as I mentioned before, I had just started the job that June of '63 with U.S. Rubber, and there was a lot of young people working that had been hired at the time. And so there was a group of us that formed some social groups and a bowling league, and we used to bowl on Mondays and go out and have some adult beverages after. And a couple of us, said, well, we should go to that funeral. So there were myself and 3 other people, got in the car early Monday morning and drove from, we were living in Waterbury, Connecticut at the time, drove down to Washington, D.C., and had breakfast, and then we were standing on the sidelines where the funeral was coming through. And it was something I remember very clearly to this day. The horse coming by with the boots on backwards, the leaders of state. I don't remember all of them, but I remember Haile Selassie from Ethiopia and Charles de Gaulle from France, seeing them marching, along with the family coming through for his trip up to Arlington Cemetery. So it was a sad day, memorial, something I always remember. When Lee Harvey Oswald was originally shot, I was saying, oh, good, he deserved it. And it didn't take me long afterward to realize that's not the way things should be done. And by that person being eliminated, there's nobody to follow up with that who orchestrated this whole thing. So I had second thoughts about that real quick. Sad day, and he was a man that I respected a lot. He wasn't a perfect man, but he did a lot of good things.
When you went to Washington for the funeral, what was the feeling like, and was it difficult to find a spot to watch what was going on? What do you remember about the city at that particular time and your vantage point?
Yeah, we were right on the curb, and it was a pretty long funeral route. So we were able to park the car and found a place right. So we were right close and could see very clearly the people that were walking by in the funeral procession, including the family.
So you could see Jackie and Bobby?
Yes.
Those memories will never fade, I suppose.
They will not fade.
Yeah.
And that's why even when you mention the date, it's I remember right away what that date was. It's a date that will stay with me forever.
Well, Tom, thanks for being here and thanks for your memories.
You're welcome. Appreciate it. The only other comment I'd say, I wish that the politics back then were much more tolerable than they are now, and I wish we could get back to that way where both the Republicans and the Democrats would have a little better relationship. Amen.
You're asking for a lot. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, you're welcome.
that concludes part 3 of our 5-part series, Westborough Remembers November 22nd, 1963. I hope that you will join us for the remaining parts and more memories from the people of Westborough. Until then, this is Paul McGrath saying thanks for watching, and I hope to see you at the game, and if you're not playing in the game, I hope to see you on the sidelines.